In this video, we're looking at the impact of European colonization on Africa. European countries have been in Africa for decades, mainly Britain, France, and Portugal. So let's put them here. The three main countries that colonized the continent are Britain, so let's put them here. So the first one is Britain, right? Second one is France, and the third one is Portugal. Of course, there were other countries like Netherlands, Belgium, but these were the three main countries that colonized the continent. So what were the effects of colonization on the continent? Now, there are five main effects. Of course, it's not limited to just five. There are definitely more, but five main effects of colonization of the continent. The first one is the creation of random, right? And this is a very important one. Random is the key word here. The creation of random political boundaries that divided ethnic groups and prompted ethnic conflict. And this is a very important point here because it really divided communities and divided ethnic groups. You can see the boundaries coming to the map here. You can see the boundaries are very arbitrary, right? No logic to it, right? No logic, right? No logic to the boundary division, no sense whatsoever, right? It's haphazard. Haphazard. That's what it was, haphazard. And that's why today you will see one ethnic group in two countries. For example, you have the Yorubas in Western Nigeria. You have Yorubas in Eastern Benin Republic as well. The same people, two different countries, speaking two different languages. The ones in Nigeria speak English and the ones in Benin Republic speak French. And that's a perfect example of these random political boundaries that were divided, that divided ethnic groups and prompted ethnic conflict. And oftentimes it brought about resentments and animosity amongst, once upon a time, an ethnic group that was getting along, that loved, one another and so forth. Suddenly they have ethnic conflicts because of these divisions. And this is a very important point to note. Because before the arrival of the Europeans, Africans had no boundaries. And you could go from one country to the other or one place to the other and then interact with people. And they came and placed boundaries haphazardly, without logic and without sense, all across the continent. That's the first main impact. The second main impact is power was left with certain ethnic groups, leaving out others, right? And of course, again, this caused resentments, distrust, and more conflict, right? Brought about distrust amongst people, the citizens of the country, and more conflict. Again, we see that in countries around the continent. In Nigeria, for example, power was left with the North, the Hausa Fulani group. And today, that has become a source of conflict, a source of resentment and political marginalization and so forth. This is a very important point. And this was happening because they did not really know the people. There was no consultation, hardly any consultation. They just left power with the group that maybe they favored the most, significant resentments, or the group that was most loyal to them, or whatever the case may be. And that's how they left the continent, in an unorganized, unceremonial, haphazard, illogical way, right? So power was left with certain ethnic groups, leaving out others in the process. And because they left out others in the process, that gave rise, let's put it here, to resentments. That gave rise to political crisis in most cases, right? Political crisis in most cases, demonstrations, military coups, accusations, and what have you. And again, this is a significant point to note. As it says here, this often led to distrust and more conflict. The third point is African leaders used their newfound power to oppress others who may have opposed independence. Yes, there were some that opposed independence amongst them because they were benefiting from the European powers in one way or the other, or had opposing political views, right? So they used the opportunity to exert their power, to exert their influence on opposition figures, right? People that opposed independence, fought against the movement for independence, or simply had opposing views on the economy, on politics, on society, and so forth. And rather than building capacity, and rather than building infrastructure and and moving the country forward and the continent forward as well. Some of these leaders, not all, but some of these leaders were engaged in retribution. They were engaged in revenge. They were wanting to make sure that the opposition was dealt with, and this was their opportunity to, exert their power. And that did not go well in terms of development. That did not aid development, and instead it, brought about resentment, because the ethnic group that the opposition belongs to will see this as deliberate attempt to punish them, deliberate attempt to put pressure on them, to agree perhaps, deliberate attempt to target them for their opposition or for the position of their main leaders. The fourth point here is empower political parties to push for progressive agendas, right? And exert true independence. Exert true independence. And this is a very important point as well. True independence in national interest. And that's why you saw several African countries, becoming a republic. Nigeria, for example, became a republic. Nigeria, the largest country, became a republic in 1963. Zimbabwe, thereafter, after independence in 1980, became a republic, and many countries, Kenya became a republic, Ghana became a republic, and many of these countries became republics. True independence, that's what is meant by true independence in national interest. And the political parties were putting together an agenda to move the country forward, to move the continent forward, economically, politically. They were establishing democratic rule. They were entrenching the rule of law, and making sure that they had what it took to be really independent. And that was a good impact of colonization, so to speak, because of the bad experience that these leaders have had, because of the bad experience that the country has had. They really wanted to entrench democracy and exert themselves and their identity. That way, they can overcome the impact of colonization. The final point here is economic ruins of the continent, where the colonizing powers, pillaged the continent, siphoned valuable items, artwork, for example, that is still being returned today, 100 years after they've been stolen from the continent, natural resources taken away from the land without compensation, a lot of the gold and the diamond and the minerals and so forth taken away, etc. Essentially leaving the continent on its own without any resources. And that's a very significant negative impact on the continent, because the continent is still recovering today, many decades after colonization, from the resources that were taken and stolen from the continent. And the ones that were not stolen, some of them were destroyed. Infrastructure that were destroyed by the colonizing powers, and the demoralization of the population, and the lack of self-esteem and imposition of their language, right, and the cultural divide of the continent, and all of those things were a significant impact, right? Economic ruins of the continent and the cultural divide of the continent, position of their language, and the eroding of African culture and language. All of those things were significant adverse impact of colonization on the continent. And that's why it's important for us to understand this point, because colonization was not good for the continent, and its impact today, many years, African countries have been independent for 50, 60, 70 years, but the impact is still felt today, because of the deep wounds of colonization, of the deep cuts of the colonization. So once again, the impacts, 5 key impacts: the creation of random political boundaries, the first one. Let's clear this off. So the first one, once again, is the creation of political boundaries, random, and this is the key word here, random political boundaries that divided ethnic groups. Now let's go to the second one. Power was left with certain ethnic groups, leaving out others in the process. And these often led to distrust and more conflict. And again, we have many examples. Nigeria is one good example, with ethnicities going against each other based on religious grounds and based on ethnic grounds and so forth. African leaders used their newfound power to oppress others who may oppose independence, or may have opposed independence, or simply had different opposing views, political views, economic views, societal views, even religious views. Number 4, empower political parties to push progressive agendas and assert true independence. And here we talk about a lot of these countries abandoning the monarchy, becoming republics, asserting themselves, asserting true independence as independent countries, and economic ruin of the continent and cultural devastation of the continent. So these are the consequences of colonization, the effects, the impact of colonization that have been felt many, many years after the end of colonization. And we have to understand this point because it puts the entire occupation, colonization of the African continent into perspective.